January 2nd, 1992, South Brooklyn. Nicky Black's Toyota Land Cruiser has just been spotted by some guys who, like him, are in the Colombo Mafia, one of New York's 5 families. But unfortunately, things are not going well for Colombo family unity, because a civil war, the third in the last 40 years, has broken out. The Colombo Wars have been some of the worst violence that's rocked New York's 5 families in forever. How bad are they? Even a stone-cold killer like Paulie Gualtieri says he only survived the second one by the, quote, skin of his nuts. The Colombos came to be when Old Man Profaci's reign began after the original Godfathers in New York were assassinated, and Lucky Luciano organized the whole thing, the 5 families, all that. Profaci was the head of a major bootlegging gang, and he ruled things until the first internal Colombo War kicked off in the 1950s. Joseph Colombo, the namesake, eventually takes over, before the second war kicks off in the mid-70s that ends with Carmine Prosecco taking over. Now, we're in the third war. This one kicking off in 1991 when Carmine is imprisoned and Vic Orena makes a move while Carmine is locked up, and the family once again splits into rival factions and goes to work murdering each other. Before it's over, there'll be at least 12 dead and 18 missing in only 2 years. On this particular day, Greg Scarpa, nicknamed the Grim Reaper, is going what him and the fellas call hunting, looking for rival faction members to kill. Scarpa is no slouch. By the time he dies, they'll say he killed between 20 and 100 people. Allegedly, he also once, in the 1950s, helped the FBI track down the bodies of 3 murdered civil rights workers by sticking a gun in the mouth of a KKK member. Basically, he's somebody you want on your side, and he's on the Carmine Prosecco side of the Mafia war. Now, Nicky Black, he's been made a capo, and he's backing his boy and sort of mentor, Vic Orena. Black and Scarpa used to be close, but friendships and organized crime families, they don't last. Neither does loyalty. One guy Nicky Black is still close with, though, is his nephew, and the focus of this episode, Louis Scarcella. Scarcella in the early 90s is a hotshot NYPD detective, so revered as the type of guy who can get a murder confession no one else can, that he eventually appears on the Dr. Phil show. He's like something out of Central Casting. Jacked biceps, always smoking a cigar, well-dressed, good-looking, but also rough and tumble. The kind of guy the city needed in the 1990s. The guy makes cases. Except for that one time his uncle Nicky was suspected of murdering a drug dealer that got his daughter hooked on heroin. Scarcella was supposed to solve that murder, but it turns out he never really did. But back to the Grim Reaper and Nicky Black. Also joining Scarpa is his mentee, Larry Mazza. Like any old school mafia guy who is still with us and now free, you can find Larry's book in stores, and he's always on interviews and podcasts, all that sort of thing. He's admitted to helping kill 25 people. I think he took credit for firing the shots for 4 of them. Here's how he describes what happens next. Quote, Greg had his rifle, but he was having trouble with the security clip. I had the shotgun, a 12-gauge, double-barreled, riot-control gun stolen from a police car in Lakewood, New Jersey. Greg said, let's get him. So I opened my window, pulled out the shotgun. I was close enough I could have smacked him. I aimed right behind his ear. I saw his whole face fly off, including his nose, and hit the windshield. It was chilling. Nicky Black is gone, instantly dead. Scarcella eventually happens on the scene that night, and he's furious. A couple of Carmine's guys are around, and he tries to fight them. He doesn't get assigned this murder case, though. He does continue to get assigned plenty of others, and he's going to become infamous for what happens in dozens of those other murder cases he did solve. Kind of. This is the Underworld Podcast. Welcome back to the Underworld Podcast, an audio experience where 2 journalists tell you a story about crime. Global crime, generally organized crime, nothing to do with serial killers or trailer park marriages gone bad, cartels and mafias and guys from Corsica who wear $4,000 suits. and guys from Albania who wear much cheaper tracksuits. I am one of your hosts, Danny Golds. I am usually joined by Sean Williams, who is in fact from England. That is true, but he is not here today, and I will explain why in a second. As always, bonus episodes are available for a low, low price at patreon.com/The Underworld Podcast, or you can sign up on Spotify or iTunes. You know, we have all the social media. Follow us there, follow us here, maybe send us some free stuff. Email us at theunderworldpodcast@gmail.com. Go to our merch site. I think it's underworld.com/merch, MERCH. Tell other podcasts you like that are much more popular to have us on as guests. You know, we're all in this together. Today, Sean is not here because I am joined by special guest Steve Fishman, a real old school long form writer who makes a habit of interviewing people who don't want to be interviewed. Steve has a new podcast out called The Burden, and it's about the most corrupt cop in NYPD history. Is he actually? I don't know. Who knows? It's a hard thing to qualify, or is it quantify? Whatever it is. One thing I do know is that superlatives are good for getting downloads. Steve, thank you so much today for joining us.
Happy to be here, Danny.
What can you tell us about detective, or I guess former detective, Louis Scarcella?
Right. Retired detective Louis Scarcella, who really the main character of the podcast that I've just spent a couple years working on, The Burden. And so I know a lot about Louis. Go back to the 80s and 90s, even the 70s a little bit. And Detective Scarcella was kind of one of the most famous detectives of that era, that really high crime era in New York, actually in the country. And he was sometimes called the Prince of the City. He also had a superhero kind of nickname. He was called the Hulk by some of his fellow policemen because he could like bench press 400 plus pounds. So he was known for solving the hardest cases, getting the confessions no other detectives could get. And then fast forward 25 years and 21 people he helped convict have had their convictions overturned. So now he goes from the most famous to the most infamous detective. And one thing that's always really fascinated me about him has been his connection to the mob. Very, very little known. I don't know if it's known at all. He had mob connections on both sides of his family. Frankie Yale on his father's side, and then very important person in his life on his mother's side. His mother's brother is Nicky Black Grancio. So his nickname is Black or Blackie, after the color of his hair. And Nicky was reached capo in the Colombo crime family and was a huge influence and very closely emotionally connected to Detective Scarcella.
Yeah, and you mentioned that Louis was born and raised in Bensonhurst, Brooklyn, which for people who don't know, that was like I think it still is a pretty Italian enclave. You're talking cops, firefighters, people who work for the city, things like that. And I think, it was a pretty big mafia enclave as well back then. Maybe still is. I don't know. Yeah. So who was Nicky Black? Like, what was his relationship like with Louis as well? And how did Nicky what was his involvement in the mafia?
So Bensonhurst, like you say, it's civil service and mobsters. You kind of had two roots, and we're saying that in Scarcella's family, you had both. So his father's a cop, his brother's a cop, and his uncle, Nicky Black, Nicky Grancio, is a mobster. Really from the beginning, he's a mobster. Becomes vice president of a local Teamsters union, which is mob-controlled. It's trucking companies that he's really running the hiring for, and so he has lots of influence in the community. Always has money and always very involved in the Colombo family and, climbing the ladder in the Colombo family. Now, at the same time, he's a big figure in the future detective Scarcella's life. I mean, Louis tells this story about his uncle being behind the wheel and them driving around somewhere in Brooklyn. And suddenly, Louis at this point is like 12 years old, and suddenly shots coming through the windshield. And, Nicky Black, being a good wheelman, I guess does a screeching U-turn and escapes death at that point, but little Louis Scarcella is like breathless with excitement. He said, Nicky was a man. He was just so impressed with Louis, with his uncle's, very visceral connection to being a man in a very kind of classic old world way, guy who could handle himself, a guy who wasn't afraid, a guy who, could escape bullets. And this relationship kind of, develops. Listen, in The Burden, you learn that Louis kind of respects his father. He adores his Uncle Nicky. So they really walk down a path together, and we'll get into it in a little while, how their lives crisscross when Louis is a detective investigating a murder, and Uncle Nicky is a suspect.
What was Uncle Nicky, or I'm calling him Uncle Nicky, what was Nicky Black's sort of rise? How did he come up in the Colombo family, and what was the sort of situation going on? I mean, we're talking, what, the 70s?
Yeah, I mean, Nicky may get involved even before that in the 60s and 70s, but he really kind of comes to power once Carmine Persico goes to prison. Now, Carmine Persico is the leader of the Colombo family, and he goes to prison and he passes the power to his brother. And then fairly quickly, there develops a power struggle, which results in the Colombo Wars of the early 90s. By the way, the third time the Colombo family has gone to war. Just like a huge side note. I mean, Carmine Persico is still really running the organization from prison. And I happened to do a story and a podcast on Bernie Madoff, the great Ponzi schemer, the most famous, the most successful Ponzi schemer probably in history. And he and Carmine Persico were in the same prison and became friends and walked the track together. And I would love to have eavesdropped on that conversation. Anyhow, Nicky really rises under Vic Arena, who takes over the leadership of the family when Carmine's Persico, known as the Snake, is in prison. He really is the guy who kind of stages a coup to really take over the family. And it's at that point that Nicky really rises and really becomes a powerful force under Vic Arena, which becomes one faction in this war. And then there's another faction which features Greg Scarpa, known as the Grim Reaper, because he was like a psychotic killer, and his protege, Larry Mazza. Now, that's a lot of names to kind of keep straight, but I kind of want to get back to them at some point.
Yeah.
But the point being, in relation to your question, is that he really rises as this family, he being Nicky, it really rises as this family is coming apart. And so he becomes a real ally of this renegade faction under Vic Arena. And it's at that point, with the war in full throttle, and really, as one of the guys told me, one of the guys on the other side, the loyalists to Carmine Persico, they would go out every night and hunt for people on the other side, Nicky being one of the hunted and one of the hunters.
Wow. And so you're talking about the 90s here, but when we go back with the Colombos in the 60s, 70s, 80s, I guess the 80s is when Giuliani went after them. 60s and 70s when Nicky Black was coming up, this is like the golden era almost of the five families in New York, right? I mean, the 70s, they were super powerful, 60s too. He must have been sort of, all over the map in those days.
Yeah, he was, and he was already like a huge feared force in the community, both because he had influence with jobs and, because he was this guy who was already known as a guy willing to use violence, an enforcer. There's one story that actually Scarcella told me about. Nicky Black in a pool hall shoots a guy, and there are 12 guys in the pool hall, and not one of them actually saw the shooting, it turns out. So Nicky Black walks free. And, it's that kind of like power and reputation and, really almost like personal sway that really propels Nicky. He's like a charismatic, he's a force to be reckoned with. And then also he's got the power base of the union, where they're skimming all kinds of money. And this is, you're right, before the feds come in and they eventually, take care of the Teamsters. And eventually there's all kinds of indictments around the five families. But that hasn't really started in the 70s. I guess it starts later on, as you mentioned, under Giuliani when he's U.S. attorney. But Grancio really gets into the mob when he's thriving. Now, here's just one side note to kind of, I think, set things up for later. So Nicky's parents are Scarcella's grandparents. And Louis loves his grandparents. He's actually kind of partially raised by them. And Nicky, being their son, is somebody who's very close. And one of the things that Scarcella always asks Nicky, now remember, he adores Nicky, but he says, why aren't you nicer to your parents? Why aren't you nice to my grandparents? And Nicky, according to Louis, responds, well, I know where this is headed. I can't be too close to them because in my line of work, things don't always end well. I'll just leave it there for the moment.
Yeah, dark. So this war kicks off, I think you said in the 90s, right? This rebel faction led by Vic Orena versus Carmine Persico's faction. What role does Nicky Black play in this Colombo war? I guess the 90s Colombo's war.
Yeah, well, that's kind of, from what I can tell, one of his real moments, because he's established as a powerhouse. So that means he's an earner on one hand, but he's also a guy that Vic Orena can really trust and depend on. So he rises to capo at that moment, and he becomes a kind of organizing force around the deployment of quote-unquote troops, of people, and a guy who's, not afraid to take matters into his own hands. So he is a guy he's on the streets, he's out there hunting. He's got his nephew with him most of the time, a guy named Joe Tolino. They're kind of a duo in there. At the same time, he's taking care of other business. So he's got some kids, and one of his kids gets hooked on drugs, heroin, right? And it happens that the dealer works for Nicky at the local trucking company. Nicky got him the job as a driver at this trucking company. And one day, this guy whose name is Aratico shows up dead. 4 Teflon-coated bullets in about 2 inches of snow. His body's found outside. And the person who tells me this is Louis Scarcella, because Louis is a fairly new detective at that point. And he is assigned to investigate this murder. And from the way I'm telling this story, maybe you can guess who the prime suspect is. It's his uncle. It's his uncle, Nicky, right? So Detective Scarcella is assigned to investigate his uncle, right? And Scarcella will become famous for getting those hard-to-get confessions. And he actually does go to Nicky and says, Uncle Nicky, listen, his Aunt Mary, his ushers, says, man, come on in, Louis. You want a cappuccino? And Louis has a cappuccino, and then he sits down with Nicky, and he says to Nicky, Uncle Nicky, so did you kill the guy? And Nicky says, I'll tell you this, he deserved to die. He deserved to die. And actually, Scarcella tells the story about, so Nicky Black at that point is united with Greg Scarpa. They end up on opposite sides in the war, but at that point they're working together in the Colombo family. And Scarpa calls Nicky while Scarcella is there, which I imagine was planned, and basically tells Nicky that he'd like to hire his nephew, meaning Scarpa would like to hire Scarcella to be a mafia cop, right? And Scarcella says to his uncle, well, what would that mean? And Nicky says, getting a few papers here or there, giving us some information, nothing big. But according to Scarcella, he says, no, that's not for me. And, Nicky doesn't push it. But this is kind of establish, what must it be like to investigate this guy who's already kind of been a conduit for this illicit offer? What's it like to investigate this guy who's also your uncle for murder? Well, needless to say, Scarcella cannot crack the case. He basically knows Nicky did it. Everybody knows Nicky did it because the guy Aratico had hooked Nicky's daughter on drugs. And Scarcella says, I said to him, well, Nicky did it. And he said, well, the FBI proved it. He said, but I couldn't find the evidence. I said, but Nicky's a murderer, right? And Scarcella, and this is in my podcast, we have tape of this in The Burden. He says, well, it's hard for me to call my uncle a murderer. And I say to him, why? And he says, all right, he's a murderer. You happy? And I say to him, why is it so hard? He says, I don't know, but it just is. So he knows Nicky's a murderer. He knows that Nicky murdered this guy, but he can't find him. He can't find the quote unquote proof that he did it. And one more thing to close that anecdote, which is, you know, the thing about Scarcella and about the mob, so the cops and the mobsters, you know, this is kind of in some ways something that you know, but, you know, these guys have in some ways the similar ethos. You know, they both have an idea of justice, and Scarcella's kind of dovetails with his Uncle Nicky. Like, did he deserve to die? This kid who hooked Nicky's daughter on drugs? Well, Scarcella sits down with me at a diner. It's actually Nicky's favorite diner where Scarcella would go to have lunch with his uncle. And he sits me down and he says, well, what would you do if some guy hooked your kid on drugs? And, you know, it's a question you think about. You know, I have kids. I have a 15-year-old, a 20-year-old, and I took the question seriously. And I said, you know, I would have wanted to kill him, but not in my blood. And Scarcella says, I think I would have killed him and just turned myself in. And then he goes on to say, this is what we call a public service murder. Term I had never heard, and that was a little chilling coming from a cop. But, you know, it made me think that Uncle Nicky, the mobster, and Louis Scarcella, the cop, they really shared a viewpoint at important moments in their lives.
Yeah, I mean, in Scarcella's defense, if I was tasked with investigating a murder that pointed to one of my family members, like, I'd probably try to throw the case too. Like, I love my uncles, you know. If they did something, I'm gonna hide evidence. You know, I'm not here to throw my family in prison. So I can't blame him for that one. I'm gonna be honest.
Well, the one I can't blame him for really is, you know, I don't know if you have kids, Danny, but, you know, like, you can imagine, you know, somebody kind of hooks your brother on drugs, you know, and it really screws up your brother's life. In my case, hooks one of my kids, you know, like, what do you do? Like, yeah. You know, when you imagine yourself a victim of crime, it's a much more emotional reaction, or the relative of a victim of crime, much more emotional reaction than, you know, when somebody asks you to debate the death penalty. Oh, well, of course, you know, I'm against the death penalty because, you know, it doesn't do anything against recidivism. But, you know, on the other hand, like, somebody kills my kid, you know, to quote Kendrick, somebody's getting killed. That's the way you feel, anyhow.
Yeah. You know, you mentioned Gregory Scarpa, and we haven't got into him so far, but I want to bring one thing up and then ask you more about Scarpa. But he's actually the guy, I don't know if you've seen the film Mississippi Burning.
Oh, yeah.
You know,
he is.
Scarpa was allegedly, according to Scarpa's ex-girlfriend, I think, or his girlfriend at the time when this happened, but this was decades later that she testified to this. The FBI, I think 3 freedom riders in the 50s were murdered by the KKK in Mississippi. 2 Jewish guys and 1 black guy. They had gone down there to register voters, and the KKK killed them, and the FBI was having problems solving the case. And Scarpa at this time, I think, was already known for being a pretty prolific hitman. Apparently, the FBI, I don't think this has been officially proven, but like I said, his ex-girlfriend testified about it decades later. The FBI went to him and offered him money, I think $30,000, to go down to Mississippi and figure something out about the case. And Scarpa allegedly found a KKK guy, put a gun in his mouth, and got information out of him about where the bodies were located, and the FBI was able to find the bodies. So that's, you know, a story that allegedly happened. I've heard another story, or there's other testimony that it's a different case involving a murder that Scarpa was actually tasked with handling by the FBI. But I did not know that he was linked up with Nicky Black and that they had gone I guess they were allies and then enemies, which is typical for mafia stories. But can you tell us a bit more about Greg Scarpa and then sort of what happened between Scarpa and Nicky Black?
Yeah, I had heard that story too, by the way. I've never investigated it, so I can't vouch for its validity, but it's a good story. And,
Great story.
What it brings up is this relationship between the FBI and Scarpa. Because let's just back up a second. I mean, Scarpa is a feared killer, absolutely psychotic killer. And I spent some time for The Burden interviewing this guy named Larry Mazza, who was he starts out as from Bensonhurst, like Scarpa, like Scarcella, like Nicky Black. And Larry Mazza is a bag boy at the local grocery store when Scarpa's wife, this beautiful 30-something woman, comes in and hits on this 17-year-old bag boy, Larry Mazza. And she gets him to deliver groceries to her house. And he comes there to her house, and oh my God, there's like some wine out on the table. And Linda, Greg Scarpa, the Grim Reaper's wife, seduces this 17-year-old bad boy. So now, that's Larry Mazza. So now Larry and Linda have this affair. Listen, Larry told me this whole story. He said, you can imagine like a 17-year-old testosteronized boy and a, beautiful 30-something woman. It was all fireworks, kind of insatiable. And at that point, Larry does not know who Linda's husband is. He just knows that Linda's husband is away a lot, right? And then one day Linda says, I want you to meet my husband. Larry Mazza is absolutely freaked out, but, Linda has persuaded, no, he's going to be good for you. He's very understanding. And he walks in and Larry watches him walk in and says he walks like a shark. He's got sunglasses on and the shirt unbuttoned. He said this guy was the picture of a mobster. So now Larry is in a love triangle with the Grim Reaper's wife, right? And what happens is the Grim Reaper, Scarpa, eventually finds out. And he brings Larry into the club and sits him down in his office. Now, this is a club where by then Larry has seen Scarpa assassinate people. He keeps a gun in his top drawer of his desk. And if a guy doesn't give the right answer, he just shoots him in the head. And then, Larry's one of the guys who rolls him up in the rug and takes him out, put the rug in the trunk of the car, and then goes to the store and buys a new rug. So Larry's in that seat now, and he's fearing for his life. And Greg leans over and he says, I know all about it, and it's okay. Just one thing. It can never get out beyond you and me and Linda, because that's against the rules and we'll all be killed. So now this affair is sanctioned, and it turns out that Scarpa has like another wife and another girlfriend. So, Larry's kind of helping him out with his marital duties, I guess, and it all kind of works out. And then Mazza becomes Scarpa's protege. So Larry starts telling me about Greg's desire to kill. He says he gets these plans to he's going to wipe out like an entire family. He's going to get wheeled in a wheelchair into a meeting, and a blanket on his lap and an AR-15 under the blanket. He's just going to take everybody out. They stop him from that. But this guy is like, he will do anything. It's like he loves to kill. Now, at the same time, and this gets back to the FBI tapping him supposedly to get involved with that murder of the civil rights workers, Scarpa is an informant for the FBI. For years, he's an informant. He's a high-level, dependent on informant at the same time that he's a mafia assassin. So that results in eventually a trial, an indictment of and trial for Scarpa's handler. a guy named Lindell Vecchio, an FBI agent, who is accused of paving the way for Scarpa to commit murders by doing things like taking the surveillance away or giving him information that allows him to evade surveillance when this kind of stuff is going on. Lindell Vecchio is eventually acquitted, by the way, but Scarpa clearly is a guy who has worked very closely with the FBI. And this gets back to Nicky Black, because during the Colombo Wars, Larry Mazza and Greg Scarpa are out hunting. This is what Larry says they did. Every night they went out hunting for members of the opposite faction. And one night they see Nicky Black sitting in his, I forget what it is, with some kind of SUV. And they pull up, like they've got actually a police kind of light in the car so that Nicky Black thinks that they're cops, because the cops are tailing everybody, the feds, the city, the state, and there are all kinds of cops off there. In the meantime, it seems that the surveillance is pulled off of Greg Scarpa so that he can approach Nicky Black's car. Scarpa has a shotgun. He hits the wrong button, and all of the bullets fall out of the shotgun. So it's up to Mazza. Mazza puts his gun like 2 inches away from the back of Nicky's head, pulls the trigger, and as Mazza says, I saw his nose hit the dashboard. And of course, Mazza brags to me, this is a very famous hit in Mafia history. This is one of the 10 greatest hits in Mafia history. Quite a piece of work in the life. And I actually looked it up online. There was some list where this was listed in the top 10 hits of all time. What I kind of love about this story is the coda, because Mazza says, like, after the hit, we go to, he's there with his partner, Jimmy. I forget Jimmy's last name, but they go over to Jimmy's house and they have a little whiskey and they sit down and they watch an episode of Seinfeld. It's Thursday night, Jimmy never misses an episode of
must see TV, man.
Must see TV. Yeah. And it's the one where Seinfeld steals the rye, so it's like, criminals to criminals. And then they drive back past the scene, and by that time Scarcella has heard about the murder and he's rushed to the scene, and he's like so upset. And there's like a couple cops there who are saying, that guy deserved what he got. He was just piece of crap. And Scarcella actually goes to fight them. He goes to fight them. This is the Hulk, by the way. He goes to fight them. He's held back. Fight doesn't happen. But Louis exploding with emotion, and the whole scene is, crazy. And Larry Mazza just kind of drives on by, back to the wars.
Why do people believe in conspiracy theories? If you're curious, I've got just the podcast for you, Conspiracy Theories. Every episode, they investigate what people choose to believe and why. The archive of over 400 episodes digs into everything from aliens to secret societies to murder cover-ups to whatever the FBI said happened. Plus, they have expert interviews and special guests. Tune into new episodes of Conspiracy Theories every Wednesday, free wherever you listen to podcasts.
Scarpa, and some of your listeners may know this, Scarpa has AIDS, right? And so there's one theory that because he has AIDS, he basically has a license to kill. He knows he's going to die, right? And you see pictures of him, you see photos of him like back in the day. He's like this meaty, 200-pound guy. And then you see him like 10 years later when he's got AIDS, and he's probably like half the weight. He seems shrunken, his cheeks are deflated. He kind of looks like a corpse. But it was often said that he kind of felt like he had permission because he knew he was doomed to do whatever he wanted to do. And then, of course, he felt like he had the FBI's protection. to do what he wanted to do, and it sure seemed like he did.
So did they split Scarpa? You mentioned Scarpa and Nicky Black were once friends, allies. Did they split because simply they went in different directions for the different factions in the Colombo Wars?
Yeah, that's why they split. I mean, there might have been some rivalry there. You know, they were both capos, kind of climbing at the same time. And, you know, they each had their loyalists and power base. But it was really Vic Orino who kind of crowns Nicky Black. So Nicky's got to be loyal to Vic. And then Scarpa has these longtime ties to Persico. So maybe that was preordained. I'm not so sure about that history, but it's pretty clear that they were working together at one point. Working together enough for Scarpa to call Nicky Black to see if they could reel in his nephew as a mafia cop. And then, you know, this deep split between them. And, you know, Scarpa's actually obviously going out to kill him. You know, listen, it's the mob, you know, loyalties shift with the wind. And, you know, if you're on the wrong side of that divide, you better duck, because obviously these guys who were once friends or allies are now killing each other. I mean, I think the war lasts for 2 years, 12 people dead, 18 people missing. Well, you got to assume are dead. So that's like 30 people. And then there's some bystanders who get killed. And, you know, it's a whole big thing in public because this is going on for years, you know, and, you know, these guys who are part of it are like living in safe houses and moving from house to house. I mean, it's kind of mayhem in Brooklyn.
Yeah, and it's just one of the 5 families, too. You can only imagine what it was like when one family went to war over another.
Yeah.
You mentioned that murder eventually gets solved, the one that of the heroin dealer, or the FBI implicates Nicky Black, I assume after he was killed. How does that, like, what happens there?
Well, interestingly, you know, the only tie that I could find, because the FBI doesn't indict him or anything, you know, even posthumously, they don't come out with a statement, but it's in Greg Scarpa's reports to the FBI, which are now public information to some extent. It's actually Scarpa who tells them that Nicky Black killed Aretico. So it's like an incredibly small world. And, you know, so now you got Scarpa telling on Nicky Black, though, you know, Nicky Black is killed by that time. I mean, another coincidence. I mean, Brooklyn, like when you get into these guys, seems like such a small place because Nicky Black and the dead guy, Aretico, are buried at the same cemetery. They're both in Greenwood Heights in Brooklyn in a kind of beautiful old cemetery there. Yeah, those families were very connected. Actually, Nicky Black knew Aretico as a kid. You know, both from Bensonhurst, those families are really intertwined.
Yeah, I mean, it's a pretty crazy story. Scarcella's story, too, which I think if you guys want to hear more about, which is just great, like, you know, 80s, 90s New York, corrupt NYPD stuff. It's really, and it's also just a fascinating story in general. Definitely listen to The Burden, which you can find, I think, anywhere you listen to podcasts. Is there anything else you wanna add about this story with Nicky Black and Scarcella and Scarpa?
No, I guess the only thing I'd kind of leave listeners with is, you know, and this is kind of my feeling, but it was amazing to me, and, you know, how closely emotionally tied were this first grade detective and this capo in a crime family, you know, and it's not just that they understood each other, but in some ways, their rules, their sense of justice, their sense of how you handle matters and how you deal with people who are dangerous and how you protect your family, all those things, you know, kind of bring people together on the side of the cops and on the side of the mob. So I think it's maybe a cliche that there's not too much difference between a criminal and a cop, and I don't think that's largely true, but in this case, I really felt this kind of emotional connection that really blurred the lines between Scarcella's dedication to law enforcement and his devotion to this guy who was living outside the law. And, I will say that, listen, in The Burden, one of the things we take a really deep look. Scarcella had not been speaking to the press for at least 10 years. And so we got him to talk to us. That's a whole other story. I had to kind of pass a series of tests in a Russian bathhouse and jumping into the freezing Atlantic. And then Scarcella finally does sit down with us for a long time and really opens up in a way that, frankly, he should never have done. But one of the things that we try to do is, Scarcella's not like a guy who set out to do bad, who set out to do evil. I mean, I do think that he operated by his own rules to a large extent. But what we try to do is go back and get under his skin and understand him and show who he was, and to some extent give his point of view on this. So, life's complicated. Cops aren't all good and bad, and guys who go to jail aren't always all good and bad. But they interact in complicated ways. And I'd say in The Burden, we really take the trouble to kind of bring you into these, in an intimate way, into these worlds. So The Burden, wherever you get your podcast.
Yeah. And if you guys want more, we actually did an interview together on our Patreon, patreon.com/the Underworld podcast. And you guys can sign up on Spotify or iTunes. And Steve, just want to thank you again for taking the time to talk with me and to lay all this stuff out. And until next time, guys.
Thanks, Danny. Great to talk.